Hi, I'm Josh, and I'm a white guy who grew up in Orange County, California.
And I'm Jerome, a black guy who grew up in Orange County but moved to Northern California. And we were high school teammates.
30 years later, Jerome and I have reconnected, and while we still consider ourselves friends, our viewpoints differ on a lot of different topics.
But what we don't differ on is that people can still get along and have civil conversations.
Even about serious and emotional topics.
Since I grew up in a white neighborhood, most of my friends were white or other races.
So I said to Jerome, hey, let's do a show about things white people say and prove to people that you can have a civil, engaging, and oftentimes educational discussion.
And most importantly, we both agree that racism isn't political. So we promised each other we would keep politics out of the show.
That's part of our plan to show everyone that these conversations can be positive.
So send us your topics.
And we'll do our best to discuss the things that you hear white guys say. Hey folks, welcome back to Things White Guys Say. Jerome and I took a little time off for the holidays, spent time with our family, and boy, did a lot happen during that time. And we're going to talk about it today, and we're going to talk about it in the spirit of unity. And again, one of the reasons Jerome and I, if not the main reason, started the show was to show, hey, we don't agree on everything. In fact, Jerome and I are learning we don't agree on much when it comes to some of the stuff that's been happening lately, but we want to demonstrate that you can still discuss it. And at the end of the discussion, one of our goals is going to be to identify those areas where we have common ground and say, hey, maybe that's the right place for us to start discussing some of these issues. And I know Jerome hates it when I say to make baby steps, because he said, hey, we've been trying to make baby steps for a couple hundred years now. But from a Caucasian's perspective, to prioritize something that hasn't been a priority, it does need to start with baby steps. But so I want to ask Jerome to share a real short, quick story with you about one day when we were texting a few months ago about something that we didn't necessarily agree on that was happening politically during the election. And Jerome, you just want to share that story and lead us off here, bud.
Yeah, so nice to see you. Hope you had good holidays. We were going back and forth. We were talking about something to do with the show, and I was in my mind, I'm talking out loud, I'm texting, and my son walks up to me and he says, "Dad, who are you arguing with?"
Wait, can you see it? You can see it on your face, or
yeah, just because I'm animated and and I'm, oh man, and I'm doing all that back and forth, and I said to my turn, we're not arguing, we're having a discussion. And that's where we need to be. We need to be where two people can sit down, hear each other out, find common ground, agree to disagree on the things that, for whatever reasons, life experiences, you can't find that similarity with, but to be able to have those conversations and find those common places.
So the short story you told me is, hey man, my kid just walked in and said, Dad, are you okay? Is everything good? And you're like, oh yeah, me and Josh, we're cool like this. We can say whatever. And we just brush it off and keep going, which by the way, is, as Gen Xers, is kind of how we were raised, whether it was in the classroom as buddies or on the court, you could scream at each other and then 5 minutes later, high five each other and say, let's go Taco Bell after practice or something. So, hey, Jerome, I have a question that I really didn't prep you for, but it is personal if you're comfortable answering it. You were raised in an interracial family. Your parents are both Caucasian. You have a sister that's Caucasian that if it's fair for me to say, is in an interracial marriage. Do you ever, with any of those three individual Caucasians who you are essentially blood relatives with, all other than not being blood relatives with, you've been in their home since, 40 years now or more.
Yeah.
Do you ever have deep conversations with them on these issues we're talking about where you don't necessarily see eye to eye?
That's a great question.
Because I know that you guys are aligned politically, and they seem to, you guys love each other. You're a great family, great example of what a family should be. But that's crossed my mind. And let me, before you answer that, Jerome keeps saying, dude, you got to be more like this when we do our show. That, like, in your text, you're candid. On the show, you're a little more reserved. And I'm starting to see a little bit of that with Jerome too. Like we're both challenging each other to be more candid. So I'm going to throw that out there. Do you recall a conversation with either your sister or your folks where you left kind of going, man, they don't get it? Because I would guess no, but I'm just curious.
Well, that's a great question. It really is. I've had some great conversations with my parents. I think it's more my parents than my sister. My sister's pretty, she grew up in the same generation as we did, and so
Sure.
the world was the same. Um, but I've had some really great conversations with my very liberal, loving, understanding parents about race in America.
Awesome parents too.
And
Awesome. Yeah.
we've had points of contention where they didn't quite understand why I was as angry as I was. I'll give you an example when I talk about things like progress,
Yeah.
and to them, sometimes I push too hard, and I should more look at the positive side of it. And as the person suffering through it, it's not as easy to appreciate the small baby steps when you see yourself, your children, your friends dealing with that. So yeah, I don't think they're immune from not understanding what it's like to be African American in America.
Go ahead. Finish.
No, I was saying, despite having, three African American sons and an African American daughter.
Sure. And let's put that into three different levels, okay? So you have parents who I know Jerome looks up to and trusts as much as anybody he probably trusts in the world. They
Yep.
gave him opportunity. They loved him. They still love him. They're a great family unit. And then there is kind of the next level of where you kind of brought me in the summer after the George Floyd thing, where I saw that anger, not just from you, but from some other close friends of mine who are African American, where I was like, man, they're angry. But again, you helped me understand, of course we're angry, because baby steps were a discussion we should have been having before. And then the third step is you mentioned a couple of high school classmates who, during the summer of 2020, when we had the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor things really at their peak with protests, where some of our high school friends were going on there and being like, I'll never support this and I'll never support that. And you were kind of texting them on their comments like, hey bro, it's me, like your best friend from third grade. We sat next to each other. We got in trouble. We won't mention what we did, but like, it's me, dude. You're talking about me. What's up? So it's
Yeah.
almost like three different levels of, your relationship with different Caucasians who might not understand it. But I've witnessed that at those three different levels. And I think what Jerome and I are trying to do at this point is to take not so much people within your family, but people like me that are conservative, that hear everything. 90% of what I get is my conservative friends and values. And then those classmates we had who may be somewhere in the middle, and really just bring them into this conversation and show we can have a civil conversation, right?
Yeah, I mean, and for me, I'll be honest, man, it's been hard. It's been a hard part of my life to come to terms with the fact that some of the people that I grew up with, that were my friends, don't seem to. And again, I get it. It's a different perspective. But my hope would be that when I shared with them that this is how I experience it, this is what it's been for me in my life. And I know that you haven't had the chance to feel that or experience that, but I'm saying I do. And to have them still respond and say either you're lying or that's not the way it is, or, I don't care. That's tough. It's tough to see the people that you admired and loved and cared for, decide that what you care about doesn't matter in the world.
Yeah, and I don't know that I could ever experience
Yeah.
what you've been through.
Yeah.
So Jerome, you said to me in a text message today, which is true, Josh. I'm sure you hear from your conservative friends. They make comments about me, and I get every time. And I always say to Jerome, "What post are you talking about that I did?" Because I make it a point to not post politically. I will comment politically and say I agree with those points. And usually it's because it's not politically motivated. It's just a factual. Why is this okay and that's not? Why is this okay and that's not? I'll share the number one thing I get about my partner on the show, Jerome, and it is, can you believe this is what's being taught in our classrooms? And there was a day where I felt that same way. Jerome and I have talked about how he gets that a lot from students' parents on back to school night, Caucasian. But what I usually say is, look, I think there's a time and a place for it, and I think reform is appropriate. I don't think it's as aggressive as Jerome has suggested in my mind of what needs to happen. But I think if you want that, just like in college, you can go take that African American history course, right? That's the number one thing I get. Can you believe that this is being taught in our schools or whatever? Jerome, what's the number one thing you get about people saying, hey, Josh will never get it, da 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 da? Because I think people need to hear that we're taking it in the chin for this from our friends, but we want to do this so we can advance the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost always along the lines of, because what I always, when I talk to people about the show, it's always the same thing. Are you sure he's in it for the right reason? Blah 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 blah. And I go, you gotta understand something. This is a process, and we've both agreed to be a part of a process that allows us to hear, exchange ideas, and have the ability to adjust ourselves. And so I'll get a comment from people all the time about how, look, Josh posted this again. He's obviously not getting it, And so I go, it's not, first off, I'm not here to tell Josh how to think. He's not here to tell me how to think. We're here to share how we think, and our care and concern for each other allows us to maybe begin to rethink our own ideas based off of that information. So I would say to those that are listening right now, the conversation we're about to have, I would please ask that just for 30 minutes, clear your head. Clear your head from all of the preconceived ideas that you have, what you believe the world's supposed to be, both from my perspective and his, and just hear and listen. And
Don't dig your heels in. I mean, the whole theme of the show is unity, right?
Yeah.
And look, as I look back at the episodes we've taped, I think the number one area where I kind of afterwards get a little uncomfortable with is I don't believe I don't like the term police brutality when used generically, because I believe that 90% of cops are good. Now, I believe that I believe that there is a lot of corruption in law enforcement. But I believe that because of the long conversations we've had about hashtag and movements, BLM versus Blue Lives versus Black, that people are digging their heels in. And I don't think there has to be this, you're either on one side or the other there. And you and I have discussed that, right? It doesn't mean we totally agree on everything, but when our law enforcement buddies that dig their heels in comment on that, and I support it and say, yeah, I support the 90% of cops that are good. What I have more concerns about than most is the department corruption. And I think I've shared that with you before. I see more corruption in the departments. There's not structures in place for people to stand up and say, hey, partner, that's not okay. And I think what we saw this summer with George Floyd and some of the others is going to help that process move forward. But that's the number one thing that sometimes I struggle with, is a lot of, Jerome, what you talk about is very generically broad about, hey, this isn't good. And I want to say, just like what, and we're going to get into this, one of our topics is whether it was the protest this summer, peaceful protest that turned violent, or the Capitol takeover in early January that went from a protest to a takeover. I believe in both cases, it's the 3 to 5% that are breaking the law and causing riots and literally just mapping out, hey, let's drive to this city because there's going to be a protest and we can loot Target and we can take over the Capitol. And so those are all things that we want to look. Jerome and I are never going to agree on all those things. Some of the things we're going to talk about here. But those are the things that I believe, hey, let's not, and that's what we see going on right now in early January. All the, as much as we're not political, the conservatives are all saying, oh, it was Antifa and da da da, and the liberals are all, saying, and it's just, whose turn is it now? And how about if we just avoid that, right? And say, hey, let's try to be sensitive to what the other side is going through. And that's, remember, I'm not defending. Look, what happened at the Capitol was criminal to those who did it. They should be prosecuted. I'm happy to see they are being prosecuted. That's not what we're talking about. Okay. We're talking about the 3 to 5% that take your right as an American to protest and ruin it for everybody, which one of the topics I wrote down, Jerome, was, and then that gives the media the opportunity to say, see, they're all bad, whether it was BLM in the summer or whether it's, Trump supporters in January. And we take the bait from the media, right? See, they're all bad. They're all criminals, whether it was last summer or now. So talk to us a little bit about that, Jerome. I know that I covered a lot there.
I think that when we talk about peaceful protest as a right of all Americans, That is without a doubt one of our greatest things that we're afforded as Americans. And as we saw during the summer, and as every study, every article that came out reaffirmed, 93% of all of the BLM protests were peaceful. And there were isolated incidents of violence. Now, the basic premise for that movement was about what we're here for, which is racial equality and an end to police brutality, which I believe is a larger issue of a smaller issue of what you're talking about, which is overall corruption within the police department and the lack of oversight and all those kind of things. But I think that we have to really wonder about what the motives are in these two different protests. So the comment I keep hearing it over and over again on social media. If the Capitol protests were wrong and you saw those as wrong, you have to see the BLM protests as wrong also. I think people are missing the point here. The point of the violence, which you just said, the violence in both cases is absolutely wrong. There's no question about that. I don't think anybody on either side that is of any rational mind disagrees with that statement. That any violence associated with either one of those, we do not support. Okay, but the problem with making these two things similar incidents and aligning them is I don't generally believe, and again, this is my belief off my perspectives in my life, the majority of people out protesting for the BLM movement, it was about racial equality and social justice. That's what it was about. That's what they were there for. For those people who were out at the Capitol, and they were there because they generally, truly believed that the election was false, and they were there to peacefully protest and just stand outside and let it be known that they didn't like that. I support that 1,000%. I do. Go ahead.
You and I are trying to get people to agree on. Hey, that's where we need to have this conversation. It's I just read an hour or so ago that some of the people that are pictured in offices and doing things, destruction, they've been arrested, and that, as they should be, just as they were this summer, as they should be. That we're trying to separate the two, guys, and help you not dig your heels in. So Jerome and I came up with this list of 5 or 6 things, and we've already covered some. So we're just going to do like a agree or disagree. So it gives you time to ponder it. The first statement is peaceful protests are an American right. Do you agree with that? Your co-host Josh Luke here, and if you like what you're hearing, then check out our not-for-profit website at timeforredemption.org. Timeforredemption.org was created so Caucasians and other races have a platform to lean into for the social justice movement. It's not political, guys. It's not even controversial. It's just human. It's a movement that provides resources, tools, whatever you might need for individuals, corporations, and communities that may not be comfortable with existing social justice organizations. So if this sounds good to you guys, check out timefor redemption.org and just join in and do your part to end systematic and institutionalized racism. Hey, I did it, folks. You can too.
I definitely agree with that. I think it's the cornerstone of what we are in this country, and the vast majority of all protests in this country from the beginning of time have been peaceful protests.
Yeah, protesting is as American as apple pie is what I always say.
And Josh, I'll even make this argument. If you send out 100 people and 99 of them are peaceful and one of them throws a rock through a window, to me, that's a peaceful protest. And you isolate and you arrest the clown that threw the rock through the window, but you don't call the whole protest a violent riot.
All right, I'm going to call you on this one.
Okay.
Let's apply that to police brutality.
Okay.
So we've talked about that before, and this is what you want. You want me to be more candid, and I think we are being more candid, which is good. So do you believe that that's accurate with law enforcement? Not so much has it happened, because it clearly hasn't happened. There's clearly not enough protocols and protections. And I think of 3 or 4 buddies we have that we grew up with that were in law enforcement. Do they feel protected in going to their boss or their department and saying that guy's breaking the rules. That's where I come in. When I hear police brutality, that's really the only area where I'm like, hey, that term's okay. Are we giving people support other than the minority of people, of cops that are bad? But I don't. I'm very uncomfortable on the show when we say it generically for that reason, because I don't want to get all those emails from people saying, dude, you think cops are bad? No, cops are great. It's the 3-5%, whatever that percentage is, that are abusing the rules that aren't great. So address that.
Well, I think what you're saying, the 3 to 5% that are abusing those rules. And Josh, I'll be honest, I think it's less than 3 to 5%. I don't think 5% of cops are out beating and murdering Black people. I think it's
time out real quick. Did everybody hear that? So Jerome and I, like, that's cool. No, I'm complimenting you, saying, hey, like, most people would be like, man, Jerome thinks all cops. No, we're both agreeing on this topic, and that's why we're here, to show that we can agree on things. Keep going.
So I'd have to see the numbers of police there are in this country. And so if it's whatever it is, it's 50,000, it's more than that, but it's 50,000. If 1% of them are committing violent acts and abusing and brutalizing people, and the other 99 are staying quiet about it, that needs to end. That's not an acceptable situation. That's my argument, my point. I'm not disagreeing with you that I think the real problem is the silence of the good police officers. It's not, you're going to find bad people in every profession there is. There's bad teachers, there's bad firemen, but the problem is they have such power, and if they're not being overseen and they're not calling each other out on their behavior, that's deadly. And that's where that issue comes in. But I do believe that the vast majority of police officers are good individual cops, and the lack of oversight is the problem on each other.
So Jerome and I are both teachers, so we can say there are bad teachers and there are good teachers. I'm a public speaker too, and there are definitely bad public speakers. I've seen a lot of them. And folks, on that note, a lot of folks ask Jerome and I, hey, like, other than just like, unity and starting the conversation, what are you guys doing this for? Jerome and I would love to come to your company or to your event and kind of do what we're doing right now and lead a discussion in front of you on stage about how you and your organization and your community in your company can talk more about systematic racism, can just lead the example, and you can see that we try to have fun with serious topics, which is difficult. It's really difficult at times, but if you're looking for a public speaker for your association, that's what I do for a living. I'm kind of dragging Jerome into it, saying, dude, you're the one with the great platform here, being raised in a Caucasian family. But I think the dynamic I bring to the table as an old friend who's conservative gives us the ability to have candid conversations. We're looking forward to our first opportunity to do that on a stage, and we would love for you to be the first to call us. So just reach out to us on the website. So Jerome, the second bullet point here, okay, is agree or disagree. Criminal activity and destruction is never okay in this country, whether it is associated with a peaceful protest or not. Agree or disagree? I think you kind of already answered this, but
let me be really clear about this, because I think agree and understand are two different things. So I agree that ultimately would never be what we would want to see in our country. We don't want to see violence. Violence is not something that we want to see. I understand the despair and and what lack of opportunity and hope does to a people. And that, I mean, hell, our country, the United States of America, was built off of violence, reaching against oppression, reaching against those things. So I understand it. I don't like it and I don't want it, but I understand it.
And that's fair. So I'm going to say somewhat agree for Jerome. And on that one, I agree that I agree with the statement, criminal activity and destruction is never okay in this country, whether associated with a peaceful protest or not. And as Jerome and I already discussed, we both believe that those peaceful protests, whether it was last summer or in January, the summer of 2020, or in January of 21 with the Capitol takeover, it was very much probably a minority of less than 5% of the people that were doing that. So,
hey, real quick, Josh, let me ask you a question.
Sure.
You know who the Sons of Liberty were, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so when they threw that tea, when they raided the boat and they threw the tea off into the harbor, we hail that as the beginning of the American, experience.
Revolution,
Yeah, the founding fathers freeing themselves from the oppression of the British. When Americans do it against America and do that type, we say that's horrible, that's the worst thing ever. So that's just perspective about, sometimes it's the things that we agree with, we make exceptions for, and the things we disagree with, we put our foot in the ground and say, that's not okay.
Well, and I think at the 30,000 foot level, Jerome, what you just described and gave the example of the Sons of Liberty is what I have been really happy to see on social media from both sides of the political spectrum, which is, hey guys, we got to get back on the same page, because we got to be prepared to protect ourselves from the real enemy, which is foreign countries, instead of each other. And I saw somebody make the point, because we really don't have a Cold War, which we grew up with, it's almost as if there isn't an enemy, because there is no more Osama bin Laden and no face of kind of a terrorist movement. There is no foreign enemy, if you will, of major consequence right now. And so it's almost, people were almost suggesting the consequence of that is we need to exert our energy somewhere. So we're taking it out on each other. And I know Jerome and I are both hopeful that we can bridge that gap and get back on the same page, because it's going to be hard to have this conversation. It's going to be really hard to bring conservatives and Caucasians into the discussion on systematic racism and social justice until we're on the same page.
And that's a great point, man. The times of the most unity we've ever had in this country between blacks and whites is almost always during times of war. During times of war, we come together and we don't fight. We see progress, black progress in terms of economics, things like that. But then when the war ends, it kind of goes back to, like you said, we've got to find that enemy somewhere, and we tend to turn similar places.
You could argue that both the Soviet Union and Iran right now are acting worse than they were during the Cold War, but for some reason we've just grown immune to it, So let's go to number 3, and then I think we're going to wrap up part 1 of the show with this third one, because there's 3 more we'll take care of in part 2. Agree or disagree, Jerome? The 3% of rioters who are not there to peacefully protest ruin it for those who are there to protest peacefully. Give or take on the 3%.
Yeah, without any doubt. I agree 100% too. I think that, and I think that the media plays up the 3%.
Oh, and that's one of our next topics, I think, is that's actually our next topic. Are we baiting the media? And more importantly, are we taking the bait from them? Hey, Jerome, I want to make a point that let me challenge you to close this show. It'll be a good tease for the next show. We have a high school teammate, African-American teammate named Gary, and I hope he's okay with us talking about him on air, because I know he chimes in a lot. And he actually agreed with me on something on social media at one point, where he said, hey, Jerome, I've actually talked to some of my friends and kind of agree with Josh on this one. And it's not about agreeing with me or not agreeing. But what it was about was, so here's what I want to challenge you with, Jerome. Is it possible that because you're so entrenched in educating on this, and because you've experienced white privilege, even as a Caucasian, as a child, is it possible that you are a little bit more entrenched and passionate about this than somebody like a Gary Smith, who doesn't educate on African-American history and has had different experiences? And if so, are you sensitive to that and aware of that?
Definitely. I mean, I think,
because I get pointed that out a lot, man. And I told you that on the first show, right? He's an African-American history teacher. He's going to be over the top, right? So go ahead.
And those are all truths. And I think that the more you understand something, and again, I'm not claiming, I'm not the know-all of know-alls, but I'm saying the more you have an understanding of a history of something, the more you're going to connect to it, and the more you're going to identify and see and relate to the things you see around you in the world. And so Gary has the experiences of a black man. So he understands that. The conversations we have, he wouldn't say there isn't racism. He wouldn't say there isn't police brutality. He understands all that stuff. I have a deep understanding of the history of black people in this country and know pretty much most information about that experience. And so for me, I am very entrenched in trying to fix the legacy and history of this country, and for people to identify it and understand it. So yeah.
So I'll close with this, and you'll get a kick out of this. I shared this summer when our bonus episode of my old podcast, my other podcast went viral. I shared it with some folks I work with because at the university I teach at in Southern California, Hope International University, we had put together a social justice kind of committee to address this and everything. And I shared our podcast with my peers and a couple of Caucasian professors. That's a shocker, right? Our college level professors are liberal, but they reached out to me and they're like, hey, I'm really glad at some point you finally said conservative Caucasians, because I don't necessarily agree with everything you said, but I found myself leaning more towards Jerome's points than yours. And so it's not, that's what we want, is people to say, hey, there's a middle ground. And in some ways I represent the position of the extreme. Jerome's always challenging me, represent the position of the extreme so we can really get in the trenches on this, right? And I wouldn't say that I am the extreme conservative, but I understand him because I hear from him all the time, you know? And so anyway, I want to close this episode. Go ahead.
But to be fair, I am by no means the extreme liberal.
But we understand why and where, and that's what you and I try to take apart. And so let's kick off the part 2 of the show with a little bit more on that. So thanks for joining us, guys. It's Things White Guys Say, part 1 of our Unity episode, kicking off 2021 just after the Capitol takeover. We'll be back shortly with part 2. Thanks for tuning in to Things White Guys Say. We encourage you to follow our show on YouTube and podcast networks, like the show, and share this episode with a friend.
And visit our website at thingswhiteguysay.com or drop us a line at info@thingswhiteguysay.com.